You guys have a good time at the movies? Yeah, eat a big lunch, watch a movie, wake you up. So that phrase, why do I care? There's like two connotations to that, right? Like, why should I care? Like, I don't care. Why should I care? But when I say, why do I care? What I actually mean is I really care a lot about design ops, and I want to share that love that I have with you. But I think all of us should care about it, and I'm going to tell you why. There are four things I'm going to talk about. Jeffrey mentioned yesterday that words are like a hack that our brain has created, and I want to have some fun with words. So we're going to play with words for a little bit, and then we're going to talk about the words design ops and what design ops could be, because it's a thing that we don't really know what it is yet. It's kind of fuzzy. But the most important thing I want to talk about is why design ops is important to me, why it's important to me and why I think it's important to the work that we do. And then finally, I want to give you a way to define it for yourselves, to say, you know, how can I define design ops where I work in the work that I do with the people that I do it with. So let's start with words. I want to try a thought experiment, and I know you just ate and you just watched a movie, but I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. I'm going to say a word, and I want everybody to just visualize the first thing that comes into your mind. You know, it could be a scene or a drawing or a photograph or a person, whatever pops into your head when I say this word, okay? So go ahead and close your eyes. All right, is everybody ready? Your eyes closed? Batman. Don't open your eyes. I'm going to say the word a couple more times. I want you to cement whatever popped into your head. I want you to cement that in your mind. Batman. All right, Batman. Go ahead and open your eyes. So I have broken all of the rules about accessibility and animation in a single slide. You're welcome. Batman turns 80 years old this year. This is Batman's 80th year. And I would imagine how many of you roughly were thinking about one of the versions of Batman that's in this image. I don't need anybody to raise their hands. I don't work for DC. This is not a focus group for Warner Brothers. Maybe you visualize something else, like one of these images, right? I would imagine that for most of you, the thing you had in your head and the thing that the person next to you had in their head were completely different. There's probably like a bell curve to the visualization of Batman, if you think about it. There's probably correlations with things like gender identity and age. And maybe you don't even know who Batman is. You've never heard of Batman before. And if you're one of those people, I applaud you because you have your priorities straight in life. And that's very good. And maybe you know who Batman is, but you just don't care. And for that reason, you had no image in your mind. And you also have your priorities straight in life. We use words all the time in conversations that turn into contracts, that turn into agreements. They make up the very fabric of the web. The web is words, right? But bigger than that, society is all words. And I picked one silly word, the name of a fictional character, and several hundred people probably had several hundred variations of what they thought when I said that word. So it's kind of a miracle that we're able to function as a society at all, because we have these word hacks that we use. You know, the meaning that words carry beyond what we look at in a dictionary, it's influenced by all kinds of things. It's influenced by past experiences, by cultural context, by our own personalities, and by the way that people we care about think about things. People we follow in the social media sense, but also the people that we follow ideologically, the ones that have the conversations and develop ideas that influence what we think. So all of that goes into what we think of when we think about a word. So let's take a more serious word, environment, right? You don't need to visualize this one. The interesting thing about the word environment is that the way we think about the environment is only as old as Batman, in that we have only used the word environment to refer to this massive, complex series of interactions between us as a species and the state of the natural world for about 80 years. Before then, when we talked about environment, we didn't think about it as a global scale. When we would say environment, we would mean the environment of this stage or the environment of this conference room, right? But there was one event that happened in history that fundamentally changed the way we think about the word environment. It was in response to the devastation caused by the atomic bomb that conversations kind of began around the globe, connected to the concept of thinking globally, which had been around about 100 years, to the concept of the relationships between the health of the natural world and the choices that we make as a species. There were all kinds of things over history that influenced this. In 1948, France founded the first formally recognized global environmental organization called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. In that same year, Joseph Stalin became an environmentalist by changing how the Soviet Union was using water, putting in place a whole bunch of policies that dictated what rivers were dammed and why in an attempt to ensure the agricultural longevity of the Soviet Union. It didn't work very well. In 1970, we had our first Earth Day, and I love this story. A developer named Jay Forrester, he tried to write a model, a computer model, that defined the way the environment on a global scale works with 120 lines of computer code. That's it. That is a really cool 5K challenge, right? It's a web joke. There's a lot more to this if you want to read about it in terms of the history of the word environment and the idea. You can read about it in this book. But with these two examples, one example of really low stakes, Batman, it's not that important, and another example of the highest possible stakes, this idea of the environment itself, you can see how hard it is for us to mean the same thing when we say the same thing, and how historical events can have a huge effect on the meanings that we carry with words and guides everything in terms of how we do our work, right? It guides how we decide what we're going to work on. It guides how we decide to structure our team and even our companies. And ultimately, it decides how we can actually measure if the work is making a difference, right? All that's words. So that brings us to the word of the hour, operations, or ops, if you're fancy. So operations, or ops, has become this very overused appendix to lots of words, business operations, and we got DevOps, right? And now we have design ops. And now there's people talking about people ops. So I want to get this out of the way. These are the best ops jokes that I have been able to come up with. So if you get your mat and you have your lotus position, you're ready for your yoga ops. And of course, to go to yoga and do your yoga ops, you have to get out of your building, so you have to take the elevator, and you don't want to step in anything, so you have to deal with apartment building ops on the way to do your yoga. And all of this ultimately is in service of body ops, right? We're trying to have the most efficient ops. By the lack of laughter, I know you can do way better than I just did in terms of making ops jokes. But design ops is very sparkly right now. It's something that keeps popping up on Twitter and in conversations. And design teams, little design teams of one person all the way up to the largest design teams of 501 people. They're all putting a lot of thought and time and a lot of money in some cases into design ops. There's a design ops conference attended by hundreds of people in its third year. Full disclosure, I'm doing a workshop there this year. At most large companies, especially companies that claim to be technology companies, design operations is usually an executive level position. And there are design operations teams of upwards of 50 people at 500-person design teams. If you go to LinkedIn, you can search for design operations. The last time I checked, there were more than 100,000 results on LinkedIn for design ops. There is a free monthly call that you can go to. It's like a Zoom call, and you can go and see someone speak on design ops every month. But if you're like Eric Meyer, and I was like Eric Meyer in this way, I still don't know what design ops really is. Like, what are the things that make up design ops? And if you have that question, or maybe you have a good sense of what design ops is for you, I have a really simple answer. It doesn't matter what design ops is. It's not important. Like, ultimately, in the grander scheme of things, this is why design ops is not really that important. I don't know if you've seen that visualization of time before. If you haven't, you're probably like me, and you're a little bit like, holy crap, like, this is, what are we doing? We're worried about design ops, and all of this stuff has happened. But the meaning of words, they're ephemeral. They come and they go. We use them to evolve how we're working together in whatever the work that we're doing. Design ops is in one of those states of evolution, right? It's in this state of growth where we keep adding things to it. It's collecting all these diagrams and models, like Godzilla is like stomping on buildings, right? Just kind of all this stuff is design ops. But I think, like the word environment, you really have to think about the word operations in terms of where that word came from and how we apply it to the design and development work that we do. Without that consideration of context, it's really hard for me to take advantage of the things that are coming out of design ops as a practice, the different frameworks and the different ways of thinking about the way we make design operationalized at a company. And that context allows me to look at where it's come from, where it is right now, and where I can point these things in our work to get the best positive result, right? So let's start with a pretty useless definition of operations. This is one that I made up, so I like it. Operations is normalizing stuff to achieve a goal. It's making something routine in service of something else. So let's go back in the helix, not all the way back, but in terms of human history, let's go back a little ways and think about, where did the earliest applications of operations as a practice come from? The first known use of this kind of approach of making stuff normalized was in Sumeria. About 5,000 years ago, the Sumerian priests developed a system of loans and bookkeeping related to taxes. So thanks for that. In 4000 BC, the Egyptians used control management as a part of the process of building the pyramids. In 370 BC in ancient Greece, they started to realize as they were making shoes, they could divide it up into different roles and different jobs, and that made it easier to make more shoes faster. And I think we're all very familiar with the impact of feudal England. Like, that approach to creating government operations led to what we now have as socioeconomic classes, where based on how much land you own, like if you own all the land, you're the king, and then you allow people to own subsections of that, and those are the lords, and then it keeps getting smaller and smaller. And ultimately, people's social class and their economic ability was governed by how much land they owned. So I think these are all kind of like along the helix, interesting examples of normalizing things to achieve some kind of goal, whether the goal is to make something as big as the pyramids or something as simple as a pair of shoes, right? Or taxes and helping the government grow. But the atomic bomb that changed the meaning of the word operations really happened as part of the Industrial Revolution. I really can't understate how much of an impact the Industrial Revolution had not only on operations, but really on how we define the work we do to this day, right? This is the last part of history I'm going to talk about. There are two things that came out of the Industrial Revolution that have fundamentally changed how we think about work. And that they're a part of anytime we think about our jobs, this is a part of it. The first thing is, of course, the division of labor, which they started to figure out in Greece in 370 BC, but they kind of formalized it during the Industrial Revolution, and the interoperability of parts of a machine. Now, I don't care what kind of design or development work you do. When I was thinking about the Industrial Revolution and web design work, there was a big light bulb that went off in my head about the work that we do and why we do it the way we do it. These concepts are really hard to shake from the work that we do. This conference itself is editorially organized around the division of labor. There are groups of talks related to development, separate from groups of talks related to design, separate from groups of talks related to research or strategy. And for about 25 years that I've been working in this industry, I remember when we started, I was a webmaster, and there was only one of me. But the first division of labor was designer and developer, right? And now we've iterated on dividing labor, and now we have design research and separate UI and UX design. And depending on the size of your organization, it gets more and more complex. And all we're doing is iterating on the division of labor. That's why a few years ago, there was this debate about should a designer know how to code, or should a developer understand good design, right? So we have our designers and we have our developers. And my response to that question is much like design ops, it doesn't really matter if a designer knows how to code or a developer knows how to design. What matters is how they communicate with each other. What is the quality of the connection between designers and developers? If you are one person, the communication throughput for yourself is 100%. Because when you say a word, you know what you mean when you say that word. But if you divide it up, you have to work on that communication process. And the reason we can't all be designers and developers is because one person is not scalable. If you're building one website for one company, maybe one person can do that. But if you work at a company of 50,000 people or 400,000 people, like where I work now, one person can't design all the websites for a company of 450 or 500,000 people like GE. So the division of labor is inevitable, right? What matters is how you divide that labor and define how those divisions work with each other. Now, if you're like me, when I said the interoperability of parts, you immediately thought to yourself, oh yeah, that's like a design system, right? The idea of design systems kind of brought to our practice by people like Mina Markham and Gina Bolton, and then made common practice by Arlington's own Nathan Curtis in his book, and then by folks like Brad Frost. It's all about creating digital machinery that's interoperable. I can swap out this atom for that atom, or this Lego for that Lego, or this metaphor for that metaphor. The swappability is what makes it more efficient, right, than building it or coding it from scratch by hand every time you need a new component. So the division of labor, it's been around for a while, but it was really the Industrial Revolution that led to making things at scale, making a lot of things for a lot of people. It started with things like textiles and things made of iron, construction materials, and eventually we started making paper at scale, and that led to consumer goods. That led right to your iPhone, basically. That's the history of how we make things. So let's take a look at a more recent example of operations in action. Let's talk about DevOps. Now, I would imagine there are people in this room who know a lot more about DevOps than me. The way I like to think about DevOps is I like to think about my son. I have a 13-year-old son, and when I ask my son to do something, like I'll say, son, because he's my son, I'll say, son, I need you to put away the clean dishes, or I need you to put your clothes away. And he'll always say, do you though? Do you really? Anytime people tell me what DevOps is, rather, they say, oh, DevOps is this. It's this particular model, or it's this thing. And they say, that's what DevOps is. I'm like, is it though? Is it really? Is that what DevOps is? I think DevOps is very simple. I think what DevOps is, everything I've heard about DevOps is basically chocolate and peanut butter, right? DevOps is the process by which chocolate, meaning software development, all the people and processes and tools associated with software development connect to peanut butter, being traditional IT processes. So all the people, processes, and tools associated with information technology. How those two things are linked and how we make it more efficient to achieve a goal, that's DevOps, right? And that goal could be saving money, it could be shipping code faster, it could be automating processes via machine learning, like automating a 508 review or automating something like load testing of a web application, right? That's what DevOps is to me. One possible goal of setting up a DevOps practice in a company could be moving towards a state of continuous integration and continuous deployment, known as CI/CD. I do not like acronyms. I can't stand acronyms. This has nothing to do with my talk. I just want to complain about acronyms. I think that acronyms create more problems than they actually solve at this point. I think so much of our progress in the world, in our history, is about connecting our practices. It's about connecting the things that we do together. And acronyms actually kind of serve to isolate practices and create silos in organizations. So thus ends my bitching about acronyms. But if I'm a designer, what does continuous integration and continuous deployment mean to me? Well, it means I have to continuously design things because I want to support that continuous integration. And I have to continuously make sure that they were developed in such a way that it meets the design standards of quality that we've set for our organization, you know, in order to support continuous deployment. If I don't, one of two things happens. Design either becomes perceived as a bottleneck in the process, where it slows the shipping of code down, and design quality becomes devalued against the goal of constantly shipping. And design fixes, things like better animation, things like fine-tuning the type system, things like getting the color contrast right, that stuff goes to this place called the backlog. And eventually we'll get to it, right? I think so, but, you know, maybe we won't. If those situations sound familiar to you, and I did hear somebody whisper, yes. So I know one person knows how this feels. That's where design ops comes in. That's what design ops is. It's whatever you need it to be to address design quality in the context of these new structures of DevOps that are kind of forcing us to work in particular cadences or in particular frameworks of how we build code, right? In my work over the last few years managing designers at companies like Capital One, and in kind of researching this topic, I talked to folks at companies like Twitter and Intuit, Salesforce, GlaxoSmithKline. I also spoke to a couple of people who wrote a book called Org Design for Design Orgs. This is widely considered the Bible of design ops, and if you're looking for a place to start, I would recommend this book. Funny thing about this book, there are two words that never appear in this book together, design and ops. So the person who actually coined the term design ops is a guy named Dave Malouf. He's kind of considered the grandfather of design ops. He was one of the founders of the Design Ops Conference. And I asked them all a question. I didn't ask them, what is design ops? I asked them, what does design ops mean to you? And if you look at the answers they gave me kind of in aggregate, there's some interesting patterns that emerge. First, from David, who's the head of design ops at GlaxoSmithKline, he talked about design ops being 3 specific things. It's things related to project management, things related to process management, and things related to people. You know, how we work with other people. So I want you to remember the number 3, because we're going to come back to that. I talked to Jackie Frey. Jackie is the head of design ops at MailChimp. And Jackie said, design ops is where you take traditional business operations patterns and you use them as a lens, and you look through that lens at how design is being done, and you figure out what you want to change. And the way you figure out what you want to change is by doing what Brennan said. So Brennan talked about implementing business ops as that lens to enable teams to work on things that matter. Now, what matters at one company is going to be different than what matters at another company. So you have to have a way to figure that out. And one way you figure that out is by Kristen's definition. Kristen, one of the co-authors of Org Design for Design Orgs, she said there isn't a way to do design ops. There's not one right way to do it. Software and tools at one company could be fantastic, right? But then if you come over to this company, they could suck. And communications processes could be great at that company, but comms between departments are bad at this other company. So design ops is really the process of constantly evaluating what's working and what isn't. And then the other co-author of Org Design for Design Org defined it very straightforwardly. Oh, design ops is everything. It's literally everything about design work that isn't actually making design. So if you're a designer, if you're a UI designer, when you're in Sketch or in code or in whatever, and you're actually designing, that's design. Everything else you do is design operations. All the meetings you have, all the documentation you write, how you get your design system to actually be adopted by your organization, which is the hard part of working with design systems, that's all part of design ops, right? So that's a start, but we have to be specific, because if we're not specific, this is what happens. If you don't get the joke, just say the label out loud. Oh, boy syrup. So it matters to use punctuation in a way that makes sense and, you know, that you're specific with your words. So anyway, let's start with the 3 things that David talked about. People, process, and portfolio. Or if you like the word projects for portfolio, you could use projects. Or you could use program. That's a common operations word, the program of work. These are the 3 spaces you kind of think about when you're thinking about operations. So in terms of people, how do we identify and hire the right people? What is a good designer at our company? You know, how are they trained to be successful? Not just to be a good designer, but to be successful in the culture of this company. How do we know if the designers are happy doing the work that they're doing? In terms of process, how do designers work with each other? If we're lucky enough to have division of labor, where we have design research separate from user experience design, separate from UI design, separate from front-end development and design, how does all that happen? How do they work together? Where is design sitting in the organization? Does design report to marketing? Does it report to information technology? Does it report to product, if we have a product team? And then what are all the software tools that we use? You know? Do all the designers use the same tool? Do they all work in Sketch? Or do they work in whatever tool they want? And how does that affect our efficiency? How does that help us do better design? And more importantly, how do we communicate? What tools do we use for communication? Do we all communicate in Slack? And then when we have to deal with stakeholders, we have to shift gears and go back into email again? And those are the only people we have to deal with in email? That's an experience that I've had a lot, and it sucks. I hate that experience. And finally, portfolio. How do we identify what we're going to design? And if we have to design too many things, how do we decide what the most important thing is? How do we, as designers, work with the rest of our organization? How do we work with people who are responsible for business outcomes? How do we work with the leadership of the organization? How do we work with the larger engineering team, especially if that engineering team is outsourced? That's a big part of design operations. And how do we communicate? What meetings do we have and why? That's all part of the program of work, right? So if you think about these as lenses, when Jackie talked about using the lens of business operations, each of these is a lens that you can use in design ops to look at your organization and say, well, in terms of design, we have really good people, but we might want to put more into our process. Or we have a really good process, but our portfolio isn't clear, and we're constantly arguing about which thing we're supposed to do first. Now, everybody in this room is not going to see the same things looking through those lenses. And we're not all going to be able to invest the same amount of time and effort into making those things better. So that's one reason why design ops is going to be different for different people. That you might have an approach that's not going to be anything like someone else's approach. Now, how much effort you should put into design ops and thinking about it as a practice, one way to think about it is maturity. How mature is your design organization? And I don't necessarily mean mature like size. I mean mature in terms of how is design built into the org. Leah Bewley at Envision, you're going to hear from Aaron tomorrow, who's in the same group at Envision. Leah Bewley released this report on design maturity. It did a study of a whole bunch of different kind of companies, large enterprise companies and agencies, design agencies and nonprofits. And they came up with a model for how mature design as a practice is in a company that frames how you might need design operations in an interesting way. So you're trying to figure out, let's say, do I need to have a full-time position dedicated to design operations? Well, there are 5 levels of organizations that came out of this research. That's not to say this is the reality. This is just what the research seemed to show. The most basic level of design that you can practice is level 1. If you're just designing screens, if all we do in this company is make screens, that's kind of the first level of design maturity. The second level, they call it connectors. So if you're in a company where we make a lot of screens, but suddenly we have to have a workshop to decide what screens we make, and we facilitate that workshop to get agreement about what should be on the screen and what shouldn't, that's that second level. But between that second level and the third level, which is known as architects, which is where you can scale the design process to multiple teams across the organization, it becomes really important to look at design operations and take it seriously. Because otherwise, you're not going to be able to grow design as a practice across the company, right? Now, when you see this diagram, you might think, oh, our design team isn't big enough to need design operations yet. And what they found in this study actually was design maturity and the size of the design team are not correlated. The largest team is actually level 3 teams, the middle team. But level 4 and level 5 teams, more mature design practices, those teams are actually smaller. So design ops isn't a function of design team size. It's a function of what role design plays in the organization. The more you have design in your organization, the more design is central to your business. You have to design things, or a part of your brand, like your brand is known for design, the more you need to be very intentional with design operations at your company. Design operations, if you like Peter's definition, and I do, is literally everything that happens at a company that isn't actually designing. It's all the work that you have to do around the design. Whether you're on a team of 1 or a team of many, you have to deal with people. You have to have a process in place. Even if you're making that process up as you go along, it's still a process. And you have to identify and prioritize a portfolio. So this is a way you can get started on being more intentional with that work. And this is the why of design ops, why I think it really matters. Let's take a look at another one of those pesky Batman words, like a word that means a whole bunch of different things to everybody. This word. Right? I'm going to be blunt. I think the evolution of the word agile, going from it originally meaning a philosophy about how to do software development, written by engineers for engineers, into this holistic approach that suddenly will govern everything about business and business transformation. Everything must be agile. I think it's the worst thing that has ever happened to being a designer. I think that, and an employee, really, of any kind, there have been all these things that have happened that I think force me to ask the question, is working in Agile a human-centered way of working? So, thank you. We think about design as human-centered. We champion human-centered design. We want to design products and experiences that do a job for a human being, for our customer. We want the thing to be designed to be usable, or, if we're lucky, delightful, that using our designs actually brings joy to their lives, or it makes a difficult process less painful, right? If you're a designer, think about the way that agility has manifested in the workplace. Do you feel like your job is more usable? Does it feel more delightful to you as a result of Agile? I think most designers would say it hasn't become that way. And we've gotten to a point in the evolution of the word Agile as a philosophy where we've put words like impact and outcomes ahead of words like quality of craft and fulfillment and greater meaning, right? And I think this has happened because we took a model that was meant to be very human-centered. The Agile Manifesto was a human-centered way of looking at the practice of software development and saying for engineers to say to each other, how can we work better? But by being reapplied and twisted and applied to all aspects of life, make everything Agile, the original meaning of the manifesto has become implemented in ways that contradict the manifesto itself. Here's a few examples. These are words that do not appear in the Agile Manifesto from 2001. Sprint does not appear in the Agile Manifesto. Scrum does not appear in the Agile Manifesto. Velocity doesn't appear. I don't know if you can see it down there at the bottom, but if you know the word, I got a fancy pointer, but it's not working. Safe, if you practice safe, that's not in the manifesto. I'm really sorry that it's not there. And if you don't know what safe is, I'm really happy for you. These are words that are in the manifesto. Shorter time scale. Not shorter like 1 week or 2 weeks, but shorter than the 2 or 3 year process of defining software requirements that existed at the end of the 90s that led to products like Microsoft Office the way it was then. Face-to-face conversation, not Scrum, but face-to-face conversation in place of documentation. And good design are words that actually appear in the Agile Manifesto, that's a priority, right? I think the Agile Manifesto, it was worded in a specific way to help people think about how could we normalize things to achieve a goal at our company in a way that's more flexible and allows us to build software in service of the customer. It grew out of mainly this practice of requirements gathering, where software development was guided by the gathering of all these requirements that were a lot of assumptions, and they weren't clearly connected to specific customer outcomes. So in a way, that makes it very human-centered, because it's about creating better experiences for the customer and being constantly aware of whether or not we're doing that. You could say Agile was arguing that we were putting software development requirements before putting requirements, let me get this metaphor right, the requirements of the cart and the horse is the development process, but we were doing this, right? So here's a few things that put the cart before the horse. A wheelbarrow puts the cart before the horse, right? The horse is the person. A stroller puts the cart before the horse. I don't have a point with this cart and horse stuff. I just think that saying putting the cart before the horse is a metaphor that maybe we don't really need to use anymore because it doesn't really work. And unless you're Amish, you're not really dealing with carts and horses at this point. Now, if you are Amish, I'd love to hear about your cart and horse metaphors. For designers, I think this is where Design Ops has the biggest opportunity to make a difference. Looking at everything you do around design that isn't the act of design, and looking it through the lenses of people and process and portfolio, and thinking about how you can create situations at work where designers love the work that they do. They're really excited to do design work with you. And that's why design operations matter. You know, this concept of being loving. Are we working in ways that are loving to ourselves, that are loving to our teams, and ultimately loving to our customers? If you're not comfortable with the word love, that's fine if it's got too much personal connotation. Let's use this word instead. Let's talk about values. I think the way that you can use design operations in your company or in your practice is by starting with the word values. Don't start by asking, how do we do design ops, or what it is. Start by just asking, why do we want to engage with design operations? Why do we need it? And what are the values that drive the ways we make decisions in terms of how we make things normalized to achieve a goal? I want to show you 3 examples of values that in the real world are how some of those companies I mentioned earlier have applied design operations in a way to solve the problem of creating a better workplace experience for designers, regardless of the company size of the team. These are tactics that you can take and apply that come out of design operations, but can make a difference in terms of the experience of work. Here's the first value. Give people more time, and they will do better work. Apparently, those 2 things correlate. If someone has more time, they're able to do a higher quality of work. At one of the companies I talked to, they were pursuing an outcome based on giving designers more time to spend designing. They did some research at the beginning of the process, and they found that designers on average would spend only 15 hours a week out of 40 actually doing design work. That's about 13% of the time. So they put in place a number of design operations programs, and the result they got was a 13% increase on average. Designers were able to go from doing about 15 hours of work designing a week to 20 hours of work a week. So it's like half of their time is spent designing, the other half is in meetings and critiques and so on and so forth. And that might not seem like a huge change, but it was a design team of 500 people. So 500 people times that gain in hours is every week 2,500 more hours were spent actually designing things, which is a huge change in the way design work is being done. Now, they implemented a number of programs. I'm going to show you an example of one that is one that's relevant if you're part of a design team that's in a growth state. Design operations, it's not always about adding more process or more structure. Sometimes it's about taking structure away, about removing things, right? This design team was in a state of growth. They had started at about 30 people with 1 head of design. And they had a meeting in place called a design review. And that meeting was essentially an approval meeting where the various teams of designers would take their work to the head of design, and they would have it reviewed, and it would be stamped as approved or not approved. And this made sense when there were about 3 teams and 30 designers total, because it wasn't overwhelming. But as they scaled, and within 2 years they went from 30 designers to 500 designers, the number of weekly design reviews they had to do grew unruly. They were in design meetings all the time reviewing designs. The average design leader in this organization had to spend 6 days a week in design reviews. So what they did was they said, you know what, let's eliminate that meeting entirely and change it into an optional meeting. Let's just make design reviews a thing that people request from the leadership. So we're going to trust our teams to do good work, but if they want our input, they can request an on-demand design review, and they called them on-demands. And what it did was it freed up that time for designers to do that thing they're supposed to be doing, which is design, but it also freed up time for the design leadership to be able to work with other parts of the organization to clear the way for them to do more interesting kinds of work. At another company, they were using JIRA as a design reporting and tracking tool. JIRA is a tool built by Atlassian, maybe many of you use it, which is designed to track development tasks. But a lot of companies have taken tools like JIRA and adapted them to use for design reporting or design task tracking. This company was a design team of about 100 people. And what was happening was every week, all of these teams, there were 15 design teams, They would document what progress they had made in a bunch of different ways. So some people would make decks to say, this is what we accomplished this week. Some people would send emails, and it was all at a completely different cadence. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to eliminate that time that designers were spending making decks and kind of reporting on the work and give that back to designers. And they wanted to normalize the behavior of when designers reported on their progress so that every week at one point in the week, you could go to one place and survey the story of everything that was going on in the team, both all the progress that was made and all the things where projects maybe weren't going well and what we needed to elevate to a higher level of the organization. What they did was they created a really simple form. It's 12 inputs. And they had people fill it out once a week per project. And the goal was to get 85% of the team to be doing this behavior. And they were successful in doing that. In the JIRA implementation of what they tried to build as a design reporting form, there were over 400 custom inputs that had been accrued by all the development applications of JIRA. So to try to work through a 4-page, 400 input form and decide, well, what actually applies to the thing I'm trying to tell about our design team's progress was silly. So at this company, they used Airtable, which is a cloud-based spreadsheet tool like Smartsheets or Google Docs. And they used Airtable to build a simple data model based on this structure. We have people who are designers. Those designers are organized into teams. Those teams have projects. And once a week, on the same day every week, we want a report from every project. Airtable is nice in that it allows you to build forms like these. So anytime you need to add a project, somebody can add a project. But every week, the team would add reports. And it created a big spreadsheet every week that you could dive into and look at it by team or by person or even by strategic goal. And the really cool thing about this project was they then wrote a Python script that would scrub that spreadsheet into an actual deck automatically. So instead of making a deck showing what work you had done every week, the deck was just cranked out by them entering the spreadsheet. And this deck was distributed to the rest of the team. It was distributed to stakeholders. And it was a way to tell the story. And we could take pieces out of this deck if we needed to. Or the team, rather, could do that. This is just an example of one slide. It shows like what projects are at risks and what projects are going well. If you'd like to try this, I actually made a version of this in Airtable for you that you can grab and use it however you want. Instead of starting with a massive tool like JIRA that's designed for really large processes, this is a very simple data model that you can use. There's a link there. When you go there, just make sure you click on that giant copy base button. It will not be that big when you get there. But click on that button and you can copy it and do whatever you want with it. It doesn't include the Python script, but that part is actually the easy part. The harder part is getting the behavior to change. So in terms of giving people more time as a value, changing things like critiques and design reviews to being on-demand meetings, trusting designers to do their work and do it well. Normalizing and simplifying reporting behaviors. That's an operations trick. It's like, let's make this as simple as it needs to be, and let's make it happen the same day every week. And then finally, using the time tracking data you have to prove that design operations is having value, that designers are spending more time designing. Here's another value. People do better work when they're happy. Apparently, this is true, right? We want designers to feel great about the work that they're doing. At another large design team, a well-known team, a product that probably many of you are using right now that starts with T, the design team was in the process of kind of assessing how the design operations were working. And they realized that while they had tremendously good designers, the designers weren't as good at working with people outside of the design team. So they did this thing called an emotional acuity evaluation. You might have heard of it referred to as an EQ evaluation, but that's an acronym, so I don't like acronyms. They evaluated the team for EQ and looked at how designers felt about the work that they're doing. It's kind of like this chart. You ever go to the emergency room and you're like, how bad does your leg feel on this chart from 0 to 10? Well, this is like, how bad does your job as a designer feel on this chart. But instead of just thinking of one dimension of pain, think about all the emotions that you feel. The person that developed this was a design ops coach and consultant named Joshua Silverman. And it captures a range of all the different possible emotions that you could feel in doing design work. Now, in this instance, they used this to assess how they could improve the emotional acuity of the team. But what I like about this tool is you could actually use it to evaluate where do we need to focus our design operations effort. What is the kind of work that people feel is rude to their process? Or what's the kind of work that people tolerate but they don't like doing? You know, and how do we operationalize those things and create more opportunities for people to feel encouraged by their work or actually love the work that they're doing? You could incorporate a tool like this into performance reviews so that you're evaluating designers on both the quality of their work and their emotional relationships with their coworkers. You could also use a tool to assess how designers feel about their overall process to target which parts of the process you want to operationalize or simplify by removing structure. The last value I want to talk about is making sure that the best design actually gets to customers, actually gets to your users. And one way to look at how to do this is to think about how design sits in the overall structure of the organization. At another company, there were a lot of in-house designers that had come from working in traditional design agencies. They were used to a process where designers would sit down with the client, and they would have a kickoff and maybe use a lot of Post-it notes and draw on the walls and have a grand old time. Then the designers would go away, and they'd come and they'd do some design work. They'd make the designs. They'd bring the designs back, and they'd show the client, and they would say, oh, so big, so sparkly, such wow, your designs are amazing. And then they would iterate that on a few times under a fixed schedule and a fixed cost. Or if the work took too long, they could ask for more money, and that was built into the contract. That's how agencies work. But guess what? In-house teams don't work that way, apparently. Apparently, in-house teams have to do the design work regardless of how many times it needs to be iterated on, or whether or not the stakeholders feel like it's good yet. So what they did at this team was they made the decision to eliminate the design team. Not to eliminate designers from the organization, but to eliminate the construct of a design team. So they moved all the designers into smaller independent teams that were combined with a product person and an engineering person. This is commonly known as the three-legged stool of product design, right? And what that did was, instead of having 2 meetings for every 2 practices, so there was a design review with product and a design review with engineering, there was just 1 design review for that team. It eliminated a lot of those meetings. And it was done by thinking about where designers were sitting in the organization. Now, this is in small part inspired by what you might know as the Spotify Squad framework. And there's a couple interesting things about this if you're not familiar with it. Number one, the Spotify Squad framework, it grew out of the very problem I've been describing, which is we've gone from agility as a principle to being very rigid with agile practice. We have to do a standard agile framework at the enterprise level, which is safe. We have to have scrums, and scrums work this way, and our retros only work this way. They wanted to get away from being rigid about agile as a practice and get back to actually being agile as a principle. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about this model is let's think about the division of labor, right? The division of labor, for some reason, became how we structure our companies. And I don't know that that makes any sense. We have a marketing department, and that's where the marketing happens. And we have a design department, and the design happens in the design department. And we have a finance department, and that's where we decide if we're going out of business or not. But we don't have to structure our company in the way that we divide the labor. It doesn't necessarily make sense, and actually thinking about structuring an organization or a team differently than the division of labor has had some really interesting results. The way you do this is just think about what combination of roles you need to make a small independent team, and then figure out how to create the best communication within that team. And that's the third value, you know? And the thing about all of these stories is they all share one choice. Do we need more structure to operationalize something, or do we need less structure to operationalize something. You can add and remove structure to things like policies, steps in a process, job descriptions, like where you sit in the organization, or desired behaviors, such as getting people to fill out the report at the same time every week. All of those things you can add structure to or remove structure from. So if you remember back to the Helix of Time video, design operations is a speck. It's like this tiny little thing on this giant history of how we're evolving the work that we do. And that's one reason why there's so many models of design operations out there. But I think they all can provide you with a tactic to be loving to design and the designers in your organization. There are 3 steps you can do to do that. And I've already gone over the 3 steps. Step 1 is you start with not what is design ops, but why is design ops? Why is it important? What are the values that are going to guide the change that we want to operationalize in our organization and our work? And why do we want to do that? Do we want to give people more time? Do we want them to feel more fulfilled in their work? Maybe it's a value that's not here. Do we want to make more money? That's a value. It's the value that's guided most of Silicon Valley for quite some time. Second, what lens are we looking through? Is it a people issue? Is it a process issue? Or is it a portfolio issue? Tools like Josh's emotional range chart can help you figure out where those problems are. So people feel like people are rude when we're dealing with this particular part of the process. Or people really feel empowered when we have this meeting. This meeting is a meeting that people like. It helps you focus on how do we build more happiness, more delight into the experience of work and take away some of that sadness. And then and only then do you think about the question of structure. And that's the time where you start looking at all those Medium articles and all those examples from the FANG companies, the Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Netflix companies. What are they doing with design ops? Because then you know what you need design ops to do. In large companies, there's lots of really interesting solutions in design operations that can apply to any size situation. But you want to orient yourself to the situation first. And you can do that by looking at those big company examples. I think there's really interesting examples in government design because the scale is the largest possible scale. Or you could just talk to designers in your own neighborhood. I think right now, DevOps is driving the way we do design, and I don't feel good about that. But design ops is a way to put things in place to balance out that dynamic. So we're not just working to a DevOps structure. And the other thing is really what matters here. Like, if I look back at my career, let's say in the spiral, this is the last 25 years of my career, I'm not looking back at this line and going, oh man, I shipped code every week. Woo! Or I'm not like, oh my God, we had exactly 1,232 sprints. I do not care about how many sprints we had. What I care about is how our design has gotten better. What I care about is how my relationships have improved and what relationships I've built, and is our organization becoming a better place to work and do design? And you can do that by just defining design operations for yourself. First, examine your values. What is the love you're trying to create in the work? Then examine your own team and culture through those 3 lenses of people, process, and portfolio. And then, and only then, measure whether or not you need more or less structure in a process or in the way something is approached. That way, you can come up with a definition for design ops that's going to work for you. And it's going to be different than my definition. And that doesn't matter, right? Because what matters is that the design gets better, that you're doing that work that I think I used the word sparkle before, right? We want to do work that sparkles. Right? Is it too soon for a Twilight joke? I would be remiss not to suggest that you check out my book. There's a lot of ideas on how to change meetings to make them better. I've put in place a discount code for every attendee of this conference to use. It's A.A. Hoffman. It'll be good through the end of September at that website specifically. And of course, thank you so much for your valuable time today. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.